When cities in Vermont passed the same provisions, did the Republican Party bring this to a vote? No. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's words cut through the congressional chamber with surgical precision, her eyes locked on Lauren Boebert. Within seconds, what began as routine political theater transformed into a masterclass in exposing hypocrisy. The Congresswoman from New York methodically dismantled her opponent's argument, revealing the uncomfortable truth beneath Republican outrage: their selective targeting of an overwhelmingly black city with a legacy of disenfranchisement dating back to slavery. As staffers exchanged glances and cameras zoomed in, AOC delivered her devastating conclusion. They have the audacity to claim they believe in voting rights while denying that right to American citizens. Stay with us. Today's story will not waste a minute of your time. The House Committee hearing room embodied the architectural gravitas of American governance. High ceilings with ornate moldings looming over polished wooden desks arranged in a horseshoe formation. Morning light filtered through tall windows, casting dramatic shadows across the chamber while highlighting dust motes that danced in the air like anxious spirits. The room smelled of old leather, wood polish, and the unmistakable tension of political combat about to begin. At the center of the horseshoe, the committee chairman sat elevated above the others, his gavel resting beside a microphone that would amplify every word spoken in this theater of American democracy. Behind him, the American flag hung in perfect, calculated folds, a silent witness to the drama about to unfold. Red, white, and blue, colors that both sides claimed to defend while understanding their meaning in profoundly different ways. Television cameras were positioned strategically around the room, their unblinking eyes capturing every facial expression, every subtle shift in body language for millions of Americans watching at home. The camera operators moved with practiced precision, knowing instinctively where to focus as the temperature in the room rose. Congressional staffers lined the walls, armed with briefing books and smartphones, ready to supply their bosses with ammunition for the verbal battle ahead. Representative Lauren Boebert sat with rehearsed confidence, her posture deliberately casual yet alert, like a gunslinger in an old western ready to draw. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup camera-ready, her eyes narrowed with the determination of someone who knew she was performing for an audience far beyond this room. Notes lay before her, though she barely glanced at them. Her talking points had been memorized and internalized long before she entered this chamber. Across the room, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez projected a different energy entirely. She sat with the focused intensity of someone who had prepared meticulously for this confrontation, her notepad filled with facts and figures in her own handwriting. Her expression remained neutral, but her eyes missed nothing, cataloging every gesture, every inflection from her opponents, measuring and calculating her response. Where Boebert performed, AOC prepared. The distinction was subtle but profound. Between them sat Jamie Raskin, his professorial demeanor masking a razor-sharp legal mind. His fingers tapped silently on the table before him, not from nervousness, but from the restless energy of a constitutional scholar watching the founding principles of the Republic being tested in real time. The air in the chamber felt charged, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. Staff members exchanged knowing glances. Journalists leaned forward imperceptibly in their seats. Everyone in the room could sense that this would not be merely another day of partisan bickering, but something more consequential, a confrontation that would illuminate the fault lines in American democracy with unusual clarity. The chairman's voice cut through the anticipatory silence acknowledging Representative Boebert with a formal nod. She adjusted her microphone with practiced ease, her red blazer a splash of defiant color against the somber wood paneling behind her. The room seemed to contract around her as she leaned toward the microphone, her voice carrying the distinctive cadence of performative outrage. Boebert launched into her statement with practiced indignation, her words falling into the chamber with calculated weight. The narrator's voice would later describe how she compared the D.C. City Council's decision to grant voting rights to non-citizens to a garish television giveaway. "You get a vote, you get a vote, you get a vote," her tone dripping with scorn, her hand gestures mimicking the distribution of unearned prizes. Her performance was crafted for the cameras, for social media clips that would circulate among her base within minutes. As she spoke, staffers behind her nodded on cue, while Democratic staffers exchanged glances and subtle eye rolls. The chairman maintained a mask of neutrality, though the slight tightening of his jaw betrayed his personal feelings about the theatrics unfolding before him. Reporters' fingers flew across keyboards, capturing quotes that would frame tomorrow's headlines. Boebert's voice rose and fell with practiced cadence as she wrapped American flags around her argument, invoking sacred rites and traditions while her eyes periodically flicked toward the cameras, ensuring they captured her most impassioned moments. Her performance contained the hallmarks of someone who had mastered the art of creating viral moments rather than substantive policy arguments. As she concluded, a satisfied smile played at the corners of her mouth, the smile of someone who believed they had scored an unanswerable point. She leaned back slightly in her chair, arms crossed, message delivered. In the momentary silence that followed, the click of camera shutters filled the void like distant gunfire. What Boebert failed to notice, however, was the subtle shift in AOC's posture, the almost imperceptible straightening of her spine, the focused narrowing of her gaze, the quick notes she jotted on her pad. Where Boebert saw a moment of triumph, AOC saw an opening. The Colorado representative had brought a rhetorical knife to an intellectual gunfight, and she had no idea what was coming. When the chairman recognized Representative Ocasio-Cortez, the energy in the room shifted tangibly. Where Boebert had performed, AOC prepared to prosecute. She did not immediately speak, allowing a moment of silence to command the room's attention. Her first words were measured, deliberate, laying the foundation for what would become a masterclass in political argumentation. AOC began not with emotion, but with fact, a tactical choice that immediately elevated the discourse. Her voice carried the authority of someone making an evidence-based case rather than a political speech. She methodically established a pattern, noting that when cities in Vermont, San Francisco, and 9 Maryland communities had passed similar voting provisions, the Republican response had been tellingly absent. Her hands remained still, her gaze steady, her words precise. The stark contrast to Boebert's theatrical performance made more powerful by its deliberate understatement. As she spoke, the atmosphere in the chamber transformed. Democratic staffers straightened, sensing the building momentum of her argument. Republican members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, recognizing too late the trap being set. Journalists stopped typing momentarily, their eyes lifting from screens to witness the methodical dissection happening before them. AOC's voice gained measured intensity as she connected present actions to historical context, drawing a direct line from current Republican tactics to the legacy of slavery and ongoing disenfranchisement. The words fell into the chamber with the weight of history behind them. Unlike Boebert's performance, designed for social media clips, AOC was constructing an argument for the historical record. The most devastating aspect of her counterattack came in her exposure of the contradiction at the heart of the Republican position. Claiming to revere the sacred right of voting while actively working to deny that right to D.C. residents, particularly in an overwhelmingly black city. The hypocrisy was laid bare not through matching Boebert's performative outrage, but through the clinical precision of legal and historical analysis. Throughout her statement, AOC maintained perfect composure, her voice never rising to a shout, her gestures minimal and precise, yet the force of her argument seemed to physically push her opponents back in their chairs. Republican members avoided eye contact, suddenly finding great interest in the papers before them. Boebert's earlier satisfaction had evaporated, replaced by a rigid posture and tightened jaw. Most devastatingly, AOC flipped the script on the small government conservatives, highlighting how they had decided to expand the jurisdiction of this body to meddle into the business of D.C. residents. The contradiction was so glaring that even some Republican staffers winced visibly. She did not need to raise her voice. The logic of her argument did the shouting for her. As she concluded her statement, AOC did not lean back with Boebert's earlier self-satisfaction. Instead, she maintained her forward posture, her gaze steady, her expression communicating that this was not merely political theater, but a defense of democratic principles that transcended the moment. The silence that followed felt like the aftermath of an intellectual detonation. Debris still settling, damage still being assessed. The impact of AOC's counterattack rippled through the hearing room like a stone dropped in still water. In the gallery, citizens who had come to witness the proceedings reacted with subtle but unmistakable shifts in body language. An elderly black woman nodded slowly, deliberately, her eyes glistening with recognition of truths rarely spoken so plainly in these chambers. Beside her, a young man in wire-rimmed glasses leaned forward, as if physically pulled by the gravity of the argument unfolding before him. Congressional staffers, those professional political operatives who had seen countless hearings, exchanged glances loaded with meaning. Democratic aides tried to suppress smiles, keeping their expressions professionally neutral, while their eyes betrayed satisfaction. Republican staffers hunkered behind their laptops, suddenly busy drafting response points, or perhaps warning their bosses about engaging further on ground that had just been so thoroughly scorched. In the press section, journalists who had entered the room expecting routine partisan sniping were now fully engaged, recognizing that they were witnessing something more substantive. Notebooks that had been half-heartedly filled now had pages of urgent scribbles. Television producers were frantically communicating through earpieces, adjusting their coverage plans for what had just become the day's most significant political story. Most telling was the reaction of the undecided or moderate members of the committee, those political weather vanes who could sense which way the wind was blowing. Where they had been politely attentive during Boebert's statement, they now leaned forward with genuine interest, some nodding despite themselves at the historical connections AOC had drawn. Power in the chamber was visibly shifting, not through volume or theatrics, but through the irresistible pull of a compelling argument. The committee chairman, despite his efforts to maintain a facade of impartiality, betrayed his own reaction through micro-expressions. A subtle nod, the ghost of a smile quickly suppressed. Even he, a veteran of countless congressional battles, seemed impressed by the systematic dismantling he had just witnessed. For Boebert, the shifting atmosphere was palpable and uncomfortable. Her earlier confidence had curdled into defensive rigidity. Her jaw worked silently as she fought the urge to interrupt, knowing instinctively that any interjection now would appear as weakness rather than strength. The spotlight she had so confidently stepped into minutes ago now felt like an interrogation lamp, exposing not just her argument, but the shallow foundations upon which it was built. AOC, by contrast, remained composed but alert, ready to respond to any challenge, her command of the facts and her moral clarity creating an almost palpable force field around her position. She had not raised her voice once, yet somehow her words seemed to echo more powerfully through the chamber than Boebert's performative indignation. The strategic pivot, from defense to prosecution. Having systematically dismantled Boebert's position, AOC executed a masterful strategic pivot, transforming from defender to prosecutor. This shift happened so seamlessly that many in the room only recognized it after it was complete, the realization dawning on Republican faces too late to mount an effective counter-strategy. AOC's tone shifted subtly as she transitioned from addressing the specific issue of D.C. voting rights to the broader pattern of Republican governance. Her words became more pointed, her cadence more deliberate as she laid bare the emptiness of the Republican legislative agenda. "We're not here to talk about health care," she noted, her hand gesturing minimally but precisely. "We're not here to talk about abortion. We're not here to talk about voting rights." Each enumerated non-priority landed like a body blow against the Republican majority, forcing them to confront their legislative vacuity. Democratic members nodded in grim agreement, while Republican faces tightened, unable to dispute the characterization, but unwilling to acknowledge its accuracy. Most devastatingly, AOC reframed the entire hearing not as a legitimate exercise of congressional oversight, but as an extension of historical oppression. The continued subjugation and disenfranchisement of the people of the District of Columbia. This characterization transformed Republicans from defenders of electoral integrity, as they had positioned themselves, into perpetuators of systemic injustice. The reframing was so effective that several Republican members physically recoiled, as if the words themselves carried physical weight. AOC concluded with a simple but powerful directive that captured the moral high ground while exposing the paternalistic nature of Republican interference. Let them govern themselves. The statement hung in the air, 4 words that encapsulated the fundamental contradiction of a party that claimed to value self-governance while actively denying it to others. As she yielded back to the ranking member, the power dynamics in the room had been completely inverted. What began as a Republican offensive had been transformed into a defensive posture, forcing them to justify not just this specific intervention, but their entire approach to governance. Jamie Raskin, recognizing the opening AOC had created, smoothly continued the prosecutorial approach. His professorial demeanor provided the perfect complement to AOC's precision, his constitutional expertise giving additional weight to what had now become a comprehensive indictment of Republican hypocrisy. Raskin's words built upon AOC's foundation, his legal mind extending her argument into new territory. They don't want to vote in Washington, D.C. They don't want to live in D.C., he observed, his tone one of weary recognition of a pattern long established. They could move to D.C. and run for D.C. Council, if that's their interest. But no, they just want to lord it over the people of Washington. As Raskin spoke, Republican members avoided eye contact not just with him, but with each other. The collective discomfort of a party caught in its own contradictions palpable in the room. What had begun as a routine hearing had transformed into an unexpected accountability session, with Democrats holding the gavel of moral authority. As the hearing concluded, the aftermath of the confrontation lingered in the chamber like smoke after a fire. Committee members gathered their papers and departed with varying degrees of haste, Republicans moving quickly toward exits, avoiding press questions, while Democrats lingered, suddenly in no hurry to leave the scene of their unexpected victory. In the hallway outside, reporters clustered around AOC and Raskin, microphones thrust forward, cameras flashing. The Congresswoman from New York spoke with the same measured precision that had characterized her performance in the hearing room, neither gloating nor backing down from the force of her arguments. Her staff stood nearby, pride evident in their posture despite their professional poker faces. Conspicuously absent from the media scrum was Representative Boebert, who had exited through a side door, her staff forming a protective barrier between her and the press. The congressional equivalent of a tactical retreat spoke volumes about the outcome of the confrontation. What had begun as her offensive had ended with her withdrawal from the field. Back in the now emptying committee room, cleaning staff moved quietly between the rows, collecting discarded water bottles and straightening chairs. They worked with the invisible efficiency of those who witness history daily, but are rarely acknowledged in its telling. One older gentleman paused briefly beside AOC's vacant seat, looking down at the place where something significant had transpired, before continuing with his work. The true impact of the confrontation, however, was already rippling outward beyond the physical confines of the Capitol. In newsrooms across Washington, editors were adjusting headlines and reworking stories. What had been pre-written as a standard partisan skirmish was being rapidly reframed as a defining moment in the ongoing struggle over voting rights and self-determination. On social media, clips from the hearing were spreading with algorithmic efficiency, most prominently featuring AOC's systematic exposure of Republican hypocrisy. Comments sections filled with reactions spanning the political spectrum, but even conservative commentators acknowledged, sometimes grudgingly, the effectiveness of the Democratic response. In congressional offices throughout the Capitol complex, the hearing was being dissected by political strategists on both sides. For Democrats, it represented a template for countering Republican attacks, not through matching performative outrage, but by exposing contradictions and reclaiming moral high ground. For Republicans, it necessitated a recalibration of their approach to D.C. oversight, recognizing that simplistic attacks had left them vulnerable to devastating counterarguments. Most significantly, in the homes of D.C. residents, American citizens who had long lived under the unique disenfranchisement of their political status, the hearing represented a rare moment when their constitutional limbo was thrust into the national spotlight. For once, the contradictions of American democracy were not abstract concepts, but were laid bare in the halls of Congress itself. As the last light faded from the committee room windows, the empty chamber stood as a stage temporarily vacated, but not abandoned. The battle that had played out there was merely one skirmish in a longer war over American democracy. Its promises, its contradictions, and who gets to participate fully in its processes. The gavel had fallen on this particular hearing, but the questions it had raised would continue to reverberate through American politics long after the lights were turned off and the doors locked for the night. In the quiet aftermath of the congressional chamber, now empty of combatants and witnesses alike, the true significance of the day's confrontation settled into the historical record. What had transpired was more than a momentary political victory for AOC or a temporary setback for Boebert. It was another chapter in America's ongoing struggle to reconcile its democratic ideals with its political practices. The contradiction exposed during the hearing represented America's unfinished business, a nation founded on principles of representative democracy that still maintained pockets of disenfranchisement within its borders. The residents of Washington, D.C., predominantly black and predominantly Democratic, remained caught in a constitutional limbo that reflected not legal necessity, but political calculation. In revealing the selective nature of Republican outrage, focused on D.C. but conspicuously absent when Vermont towns or Maryland cities enacted similar measures, AOC had illuminated not just partisan hypocrisy, but the persistent racial dimensions of American democracy. The sacred right to vote was revealed to be conditional, contingent not just on citizenship, but on geography, demography, and political alignment. As the Capitol settled into its nighttime rhythms, the fundamental questions raised by the confrontation remained unanswered. Who truly deserves a voice in American democracy? Who gets to decide? And how could a nation founded on representative government justify denying representation to its own capital city? These questions would return to this same chamber in future hearings and debates. They would animate campaign speeches and inspire grassroots organizing. They would find their way into legal briefs and judicial opinions. Because despite the temporary resolution of this specific confrontation, the larger contradiction remained unresolved. The glaring disconnect between America's democratic promises and its democratic practices. For now, in the empty committee room, with only the security lights casting long shadows across the vacant chairs, the battle had paused, but not ended. The confrontation between AOC and Boebert represented not just a clash of personalities or parties, but a glimpse into America's soul, its highest aspirations, and its persistent failures. And in that glimpse lay both the challenge and the promise of American democracy, eternally imperfect, perpetually striving, forever unfinished.